The Critique of Pure Reason, translated by Max Muller, 1881. Introduction. The idea of transcendental philosophy. Experience is no doubt the first product of our understanding. While employed in fashioning the raw material of our senses, it is therefore our first instruction, and in its progress so rich in new lessons that the chain of all future generations will never be in want of new information that may be gathered on that field. So he's saying experience by means of sensation, so experience through the senses, provides us with so much raw material, so much new information that all future generations will have enough of the information that we have gathered. So he's saying sensations or sensory information that we gain is filled with so much raw material. It's filled with more and more new lessons. And it's our first instruction. So in order to know something, we go through the senses. In order to understand something, we go through the senses. Nevertheless, he says, experience is by no means the only field to which our understanding can be confined. So his next statement is that experience, which is empirical or sensory experience, is by no means the only field of our understanding. So when we understand the world, we don't just understand it through our senses. Understanding is a much more broader realm than experience through the senses. He goes on to say, experience tells us what is, but not that it must be necessarily as it is, and not otherwise. So he says experience just shows us how things are in general, but not necessarily. But how things are necessarily is not known to us through experience. And why some things are not the way they should be necessarily, even that experience is unable to say and unable to tell us. It therefore never gives us any really general truths, and our reason, which is particularly anxious for that class of knowledge, is roused by it rather than satisfied. So he's saying our ability to gather truths or to have predictability about the nature of our world, which is called our reasoning capacity, is always aroused, is always dissatisfied. It is not satisfied through sensory input. Our reason and our ability to form general truths and to predict about the nature of the world is not satisfied through the senses, because the senses are giving us only the new kind of experience, the raw materials, not the finished product, which is knowledge. General truths, which at the same time bear the character of an inward necessity, must be independent of experience, clear and certain by themselves. So he's saying general truths, the general truths that our mind is looking for, the general truths which form part of reason, could bear the character of necessity, and that kind of general truth is independent of experience, independent of sensory experience. And he says these general truths about the nature of the world will be clear and certain by themselves. They will not depend on sensory experience for validation, any kind of validation. They are therefore called knowledge a priori, while that is simply taken from experience is said to be, in ordinary parlance, known a posteriori or empirically only. So these kind of general truths that we can understand about the nature of the world and which are necessarily independent of experience are called a priori knowledge. And the knowledge that we get through sensations, through our senses, through experience is called a priori knowledge. He goes on to say, now it appears, and this is extremely curious, that even with our experiences, different kinds of knowledge are mixed up, which must have their origin a priori, and which perhaps serve only to produce a certain connection between our sensuous representations. So he's saying that this kind of a priori knowledge, the kind of knowledge that we can use to make general rules about the nature of our experience. For instance, if we see in front of us a table and a chair, a priori knowledge will give us the knowledge in advance of the relationship between a table and chair. For instance, the distance between the table and chair, the relationship between the size and shape of the chair and table without or irrespective or even before we go to measure it through our senses. So a priori knowledge will give us connections, will give us truths about the connections between sensuous representations, that is, between sensory information that we get from the world. For instance, a priori knowledge will tell us how tall or how big the chair is compared to the table, and so on. For even if we remove from experience everything that belongs to the senses, there remain nevertheless certain original concepts and certain judgments derived from them, which must have had their origin entirely a priori and independent of all experience, because it is owing to them that we are able to, or imagine that we are able, or imagine we are able to predicate more of the objects of our senses than can be learned from mere experience, and that our propositions contain real generality and strict necessity, such as mere empirical knowledge can never supply. So he's saying the advantage of having a priori experience is that we can imagine more and more similar kinds of objects. So for instance, if I see a round ball, I can predict the properties of this ball, and then the next time when I see something which looks round enough, I can predict the nature of that entity that I'm seeing. So a priori knowledge helps us in predicating our future experiences. And by objects of senses, he means the objects that we receive through experience, the objects that we see, hear, touch, smell, or taste. And he says this kind of generality, this kind of knowledge that we acquire of generalizing properties is not given through empirical knowledge. It is a priori, and all this a priori knowledge probably, he says, probably lie at the origin of these experiences that we are having. So he says the origin of all empirical experience might be a priori, or might be some general truths or judgments about the nature of the world. So he's looking for such kinds of general rules about the nature of our world.